turn on the lights. It's okay if you don't, just a thought. Okay. Let's see. So today we're dwelling again on the nightmarish figure of Hyde. And we're studying, in a lot of ways, when we think about horror, if you've ever watched a horror movie before and you watched a lot of horror movies, you begin to understand that the horror genre usually examines a lot of our cultural fears. It tries to get to the heart of what we're afraid of as a society. And they'll portray these fears on the screen through certain nightmarish figures. So, for instance, uh, the classic figures of Michael Myers and Jason Valdez and the Halloween movies and the Friday the 13th movies, Freddy Krueger and the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. A lot of these horror figures would attack people and young teenagers as they were engaging in sexual intercourse and things like that. So American society is, at its root, has often been called a very Puritan society. There's great fears of young people having sex at an early age. And this has been taught, in the church and in other places as something to be, avoided. So these movies were geared toward teenagers, at this time. Their parents told them not to do these things. And guess what happened? In Halloween, in Nightmare on Elm Street, in Friday the 13th, all of these slasher flicks, these young teenagers would be having sex and then Freddy Krueger would come in and slash them. Or Michael Myers would come in and stab them, metaphorically penetrating them. So you have these horror movies that examine some of the things that we're afraid of as a social culture. And it's been a long time since I've watched horror movies because I grew up watching them way before I should, like in the third grade and stuff like that. My brother would let me watch them, and I would have nightmares all the time. I would have night terrors. I'd wake up in the middle of the night. I would be unable to move. I'd have to crawl into bed with my mom and dad or something like that, and they didn't like that. I was terrified of closets, of under beds, of everything, afraid that some slasher would come out and, or Chucky or something would slice my feet or something like that. I was terrified all the time, so I stopped watching these movies. But I'm certain that nowadays that there are movies, there's got to be some horror movies that somehow play on our fears of social media and stalkers and social media. Anybody name one? I don't know. I'm out of touch. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Like they can see each other while the friend dies. I've heard about that one. So you have to watch the friend die. What a terrible thing. Huh? Okay. Missed call. Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. Wow. So as you see, horror movies kind of play on the fears that maybe underlie what we're going through. Technology. This is a new fear that we could have that it could play on. Unfriended is one, apparently. Oh, that's what y'all were talking about. Huh? Black Mirror? Is that the one, the Netflix series that glorifies suicide? Reasons why? 13 Reasons Why. What? Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. This is freaky. I'm kind of wishing I didn't know all these things. So here we have a book from the mid 19th century that's kind of playing on a lot of the fears that this culture was having. Hush technically is one, apparently. Oh, okay. It's playing on a lot of fears that people were having at this time. Okay. Science is a new thing. It's becoming a big thing now. Uh, I know it's common to think about morgues and stuff nowadays, okay? To like think that when I die, my body's going to be taken to a morgue and somebody's going to be doing an autopsy on me. Just like everybody's become comfortable with it nowadays, perhaps. But back in the day, this was a new thing. And as a matter of fact, it was a long trend in Christian society that you could not do an autopsy on people. They thought it was irreligious. Okay, they thought that it was irreligious, that it was a sin to cut open a body and examine it, and it was outlawed. If somebody did that, they'd be kicked out of the church. It was a huge sin, and it's probably a reason why medical technology didn't advance so long in you know, uh, Eastern Europe. But in the 19th century, they started opening up medical academies. They could start doing dissections of human bodies. They could start cutting open a human body and studying the anatomy. And they would be like, oh, this person died because his appendix ruptured. Okay? They would know what an appendix was. Um, but, there were all kinds of laws passed at the time that would be, issues. It created all kinds of issues. So respectable people didn't want their bodies cut open. A lot of them didn't, after they died. Some of them would dedicate their bodies to science, to human progress. But others were suspicious of science. They didn't want this kind of thing happening to them. But the medical academies needed these bodies to be able to teach new medical students. So they would hire goons, they would hire criminals to go out and steal bodies from and dig up fresh dug bodies from cemeteries and things like that to bring them to the medical academies. And there's a story in here called Body Snatchers talking about that right there. And they had to pass all kinds of laws to kind of work against that. But there was a growing suspicion of science, of like maybe we're dabbling in things that we shouldn't be dabbling with. You see in stories like Frankenstein, where uh, Victor Frankenstein creates a monster out of sewn together out of human parts that have been, discarded in graves, uh, and he enlivens that monster, brings that monster back to life uh, through electricity. And so that horror novel played on that fear. This horror novel plays on a different fear. And one of the fears that it plays on is this idea of social respectability. A lot of folks, even nowadays, in England, perhaps more than America, this idea of, even nowadays, this idea of respectability, of like having a good outward demeanor, of people seeing you as a respectable member of society was very important. If you weren't seen in respectable circles, you would be shunned, your business would suffer, you might compare it to cancel culture nowadays. You know, if you get found out that you've done something that isn't deemed as respectable in modern society, they would ostracize you. But there must have been a growing and lingering fear of the fact that people are constantly trying to cover up these things that they want to do, but that desire to still want to do them must be under the surface somewhere. Okay? And there were countless stories, and Stevenson was an author of many of these stories in his tales called the New Arabian Nights and things like that, that kind of explored that undercurrent of what these respectable English gentlemen were really doing under the surface of things and kind of hiding it. There were underground prostitution rings. There were underground drug rings. There were underground places, a black market to get pornography and various things like that. Whatever you wanted, you could get it in the black market. And a lot of folks would do that underneath the surface and keep it hidden. I have seen Penny Dreadful, and it's got a lot of some of these things that I'm talking about in that historical fiction series. Mm-hmm. And there's a famous, I think it's called the. I mean, there's a famous painting called the Autopsy, I think. We might see some terrible images here. I'm not going to look that up. Uh, but there's a famous painting called the Autopsy where, from the 19th century, where there is a body kind of spewed open with its guts spewed open right there on a table, and a doctor is dealing with it, and everyone's applauding him from the audience. They're all watching like it's from a sports show or something like that, with all this audience and medical students applauding this man for cutting open this body. Yeah. This is a different painting. I'll talk about that in a second. I should have pulled up that painting beforehand, but I don't want to do a Google search of autopsies in front of all of y'all right now. The, the Gross Clinic, is that what that's called? All right, I'll take a chance and look it up. Forgot the name of the painting. That's what it is. See this man cutting open this body right here? And you got all these people watching on, praising him. There's one person terrified right there. So these kinds of things were going on. And this story, among others, are beginning to examine, perhaps science has taken things too far. One of the things that Stevenson is worried about is that, we're all have these aspects of good and evil in us. As Dr. Jekyll later says in this novella, human beings are all commingled out of good and evil. We've all got good and evil in us. It's combined. But most of us repress or push down the evil side of us. And our good side is the one that we show, and that takes over most of the time. But this other part right here is still behind us. And this novella, explores the idea, what happens if science creates the ability for us to separate these two selves? If we're able to purely have just the evil side of us, if we're able to have that and don it almost as if it's a mask, go out and live our lives like that. And that's what Hyde is. I want to take a look at some folks are, all right. So now I'm going to start digging into the text itself. Here is the foreword to the text by Robert Louis Stevenson. It says, "It's ill to loose the bands that God decreed to bind. Still we be the children of the heather and the wind, far away from home. Oh, it's still for you and me that the broom is blowing bonny in the north country." And this first sentence right here, I think, is one of the key messages of the work itself. Jekyll lets loose the binds that God has bestowed upon men. God has put this nature to us to where we have these good and evil tendencies, but we have a conscience that we can choose to do which way or the other. Yet Jekyll uses science to loose those bands, to let loose Hyde. It seems as if this novella explores what happens if we go against nature or God's will. That is something that science, it seems, continues to flout. So, this is the first page of our story. It's page 5. If you have your book, you can follow along. Mark the pages with me. There's not a number up at the top, but if you can find page 6, turn to the previous page, you'll see page 5. Here we are, the first chapter of the book, Story of the Door. And one of the characters you have to identify in your quiz, number 2, is Utterson. And that's who we start with. He is our perspective character, our main character for the first half of the book. And he is one of the characters you have to identify on the quiz. And again, if you haven't printed out the quiz or downloaded a copy of it, download a copy of it. And as you're reading, you can answer these questions. That's the best way to do it. It's like a study guide. So here we have Utterson on page 5, and he's described. Now, he's kind of like our hero of the work in many ways. He is, of all the people in the work, he is the one who is arguably the best person in the work. He doesn't do anything really too bad. He's kind of like a normal dude in a lot of ways. You see how he's described here. He was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Kind of backward in sentiment. So he's like, you wouldn't say he's a liberal person, nowadays. He kind of perhaps is a little more conservative. Yet sometimes there was something human in him whenever he had himself a little bit of wine. He was austere with himself. He drank gin when he was alone, the mortified taste for vintages. So he's not a person he won't give in to his appetites, in other words. And in England, this type of attitude is usually praised. They like people who who aren't excessive in things that they do. People who are proper and polite, who have good manners and good taste, who don't indulge in excess. And he does the same thing. He doesn't really indulge in excess. He won't, even though he loves the theater, he won't go to the theater very much. Yet, as we see a little bit further right about here, he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering almost with envy at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. Now, this might be one thing that sets him off from the typical Englishman. He tolerates others who, break social mores, who break social norms, even though he himself won't give in to these appetites, perhaps, that he has to drink in excess, to you can imagine the various appetites that a person, bodily appetites that a person has. You know, uh, being a man among the town, in other words. Yet it's noted here that he has almost an envy of these people who go out and do these misdeeds that we've been talking about. But he is also inclined to help rather than to reprove. So these are key things to notice. He helps people who are going down, who perhaps are committing sins and like that. He's willing to help them, even though he himself is beyond reproof. But he's got an appetite for these things, perhaps. Thus, he was the last person, reputable acquaintance, and last good influence on the lives of downgoing men. And that's how it's going to be with Henry Jekyll. He's going to be the last good influence on the life of this man. All right, and he runs into Enfield, who's his distant kinsman. That guy's in contrast to him because he's a well-known man about town. This idea of folks who are respectable, who want to go out and have a good time, you know, and try to keep a nice public appearance, but underneath the things, this is going to bleed into the importance of being earnest, which is the next thing we're going to be reading next week. It's got the same kind of thing, but it treats it with a humor and a comedic style instead of the horror. It was a common thing. Both of these works seem to look at the idea of, if society says that we have to be proper and polite and respectable and all of these things, yet the human tendency is to sometimes go out and have a frickin' good time. We can't fully shun all of these desires that are bodily desires that are natural to us. How is it possible? How does that affect us? And that's right, Cameron. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the work is saying. I mean, usually, perhaps somebody who is involved with people who are, you know, downgoing men, quote unquote, might be criticized. But it seems as if Utterson is willing to, you know, to do this. He feels as if he has an obligation to help these kinds of people. And he meets up with his friend Richard Enfield right here, his distant kinsman, a well-known man about town. So it would endanger his reputation to meet up with this guy, yet he still does. And it doesn't ultimately harm his reputation too badly. He still meets up with this man right here. All right. And Enfield tells him about an encounter that he had with Hyde. And so if you're talking about Hyde in your quiz, this would be the first time that we see him described, and you might make note of that. It's easy to overlook on page 6 here, Hyde's house. We see the first time that Hyde's house is described in the story. And the house is symbolic, okay? If you read on, you'll realize that this house is actually attached to Dr. Jekyll's house. Dr. Jekyll's house is on one side of the block, which is the respectable side of the block in London. He's in a neighborhood that's a respectable neighborhood. But behind his house, you can't tell if you're just looking at the house. But behind his house is this awful, rugged house here that we're going to see a description of right here, that's in a very unrespectable neighborhood, Soho, which is an alley for prostitutes and pimps and panderers and people like that. And that's where Hyde lives. We see how it's described. So we see a respectable neighborhood described here, and then they walk into this unrespectable neighborhood, Soho. 2 doors from one corner on the left hand going east. The line was broken by entry of court, blah, blah, blah. Then we see a sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window. So think about the symbolic ramifications of that. If this is Hyde's house, there's no window, there's no outlet to the outside world. Nothing but a door on the lower story and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper. And bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. Okay, so if Hyde is supposed to be representative of Jekyll's subconscious mind, and I guess that's something I haven't introduced to you yet. This work says a lot about this new developing, really hasn't even come out yet, field of psychology. Okay, this idea of the study of the human mind. And Freud's idea, which doesn't even come up till 30 years later, of the subconscious. The fact that folks like Locke and a lot of Enlightenment figures, they thought that the human identity was described by its conscious decisions, the things that it did consciously. This was our identity. But Stevenson's work is groundbreaking in the field of psychology because it's one of the first studies of human subconscious desires, which is something that's going to predate Freud 30 years later. If this house represents Jekyll's subconscious mind, if it symbolically represents that right there, you see that these subconscious negative desires, okay, subconscious desires of a person who lives a respectable life are to go out and be violent toward other people, or to go out and have gratuitous sexual pleasure, or to go out and get wasted and indulge in excess of desire, etc. Jekyll has pushed these things down, and that has the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. So he's not been doing these things, and it shows in this house that is representative of his subconscious mind. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, nobody could get in to these desires. Jekyll has pushed them back, repressed them so much. Tramps slouched in the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy has tried his knife on the moldings. And for close on a generation, no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors. So Jekyll didn't pay attention to his subconscious mind, and this house represents it, the house of Hyde. On page 7, we see the character who goes into this house, who dwells in this house for the first time. It is Hyde, which is representative of Jekyll's evil side, or his repressed subconscious desires. We see Enfield talks about the man trampling, Hyde, trampling calmly over a child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man. It was like some damn juggernaut. If you don't know what that is, in India, it doesn't really happen this way, but it was a common English myth that Indian people in a procession for a goddess would have a giant thing called a juggernaut, and it would run over people who got in its way and kill people by the droves. And so the English people kind of looked down upon Indian religion for this reason, and Hindus and stuff like that. And so he's being compared to an evil god or goddess from an exotic land right there. We see how Hyde is characterized here. He just trampled over a child almost as if he didn't care at all about the child. Exactly as if he didn't. Yet he was perfectly cool and made no resistance. He's got a face so ugly it brought out the sweat in me. So his hideousness affects people bodily. We see that even the sawbones, and that's an old slang for a doctor because they'd cut off your arm if you got gangrene or something like that back in the day. Even the doctor who's helping the kid right there, who is usually an even-keeled dude, is affected by this evil man. I saw the sawbones turn sick and white with the desire to kill him. So it's almost as if Hyde is so violent, is so evil that he affects other people who see him and make them want to act upon those impulses. He has like an effect upon them. All the time the women are wild and aggressive and violent toward Hyde, almost as if he is affecting them in that way. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. So Hyde is full of hate, so much so that he affects other people, making them feel these types of things. Yet, as Hyde says right here, they say that they're going to cause a scandal if Hyde doesn't pay off the parents, after he just trampled their child. And Hyde says, I'm naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. Name your figures. So he's going to pay off the guy right there in order to keep them silent. And so, as it says right there, gentlemanly society wants to keep things silent, wants to push public scandal beneath the surface, wants to repress it in the same way that Hyde is being repressed, who is the representation of all of Jekyll's desires. And so far, what do we know are some of Jekyll's desires that he's repressing? What are some things that we know that Hyde does? Runs all over little girls. Apathetic. Huh? He does have money, right? Mm-hmm. We know that he's violent, and we know that he doesn't care about innocent children. We know that he's hateful. So these must be, because Hyde is Jekyll, we know that, right? I told you that. Because Hyde is Jekyll, we know that that's some of the things that polite English society is repressing. If on the face of things, we're going out and we're helping people and we're saying this is how respectable gentlemen should act, beneath the surface of things, it's almost as if Jekyll is, and any respectable Englishman is doing that and biting his tongue and saying, I wish I could trample on that little child that I'm helping. Huh? Maybe. Maybe he is burdened by the fact that he has to go out and act this way. Maybe he wishes that he could retract from society. I think that's fair. Prostitution, it's possible that because we know he's being associated with Soho, right? Which is, like I said earlier, he lives in Soho, which is a place of prostitutes, typically associated with prostitution. Perhaps that's something that's, Jekyll wanted to do, was to go out and have prostitutes, have consort with prostitutes. And perhaps this is happening. Everything I know about Hyde, though, suggests that if he's going out and having sex, it's not a polite, nice, we love each other. It sounds very violent and brutal. And perhaps this scene could suggest instances of child prostitution as well, because he tramples on a little child. And Stevenson wrote some stuff that talked about awful child prostitution rings that were going on underneath the surface of London as well. So it could hint at these things. And it was a thing in the time. And nowadays as well, unfortunately. What is that hashtag, Save the Children? Isn't that what that's about? To stop child trafficking and stuff like that? Okay, let's take a look at the second chapter right here. You could relate all of that to William Blake and his discussion about how society doesn't care about children, how they use children and stuff like this idea of child trafficking. This idea of Hyde trampling over an innocent little child as if he doesn't care about it. If indeed that's the dark side, the repressed side of the modern respectable English gentleman, which I think Henry Jekyll represents, then it says that this is the dark side of society in much the same way that Blake says that. In this second chapter right here, we see the search for Mr. Hyde. Of course, there's a play on searching and hiding going on right here. Hiding and seeking, almost as if it's a child's game. And I told you that there's in one of the pronunciations of Jekyll that it rhymes with seek. And then there's this idea of hide and seek even in the title of the story itself. Utterson is fascinated by this guy, and he wants to search this guy out. It says something about him right here. Even if he's a respectable gentleman, he kind of wants to search out this type of guy right here to bring him out. We see Utterson characterized further. He's characterized as a religious man, a very dry man. But he's affected by this because he knows something. He knows a secret that nobody else knows. He knows that Henry Jekyll, and you see Jekyll's character right here. See all of these honorary doctorates and things that he has, all of these titles he has. It establishes, if you look back at this note right here, every time you see an asterisk, there's a corresponding note in the back that tells you what that means in the back of the book. And I always keep my explanatory notes marked with a little marker up here. For those of you online, you don't know, but about page 184, you'll see all the explanatory notes for this work, and it's got some nice little references in the back. And for that, it says all these words mean medical doctor, doctor of civil laws, doctor of laws, fellow of the Royal Society. And it says that these titles mean that Jekyll is therefore qualified as both medical doctor and lawyer and has done sufficiently pioneering work in science to be elected fellow of the most influential scientific society in London. So we see some of his key character traits. And so make sure you use these explanatory notes at the back of the book. They start on page 185. And like I said, I mark them. And every time I see one of those, I'll go back and I'll read through those notes. And that's where you find out about the idea of, Soho as well, and the juggernaut. All of these things are defined, as well as sawbones. These terms, if you don't know what they mean, they're in these explanatory notes in the back. Okay. So he's offended by this fact because he knows that Jekyll has created a will where all of his effects, in case Jekyll dies, they all go to Hyde. And now Utterson knows who Hyde is, and he feels that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll. Probably Jekyll did something in the past that he wants to hide. And so he has been blackmailed by Hyde to hide these things. And if Hyde is indeed representative of his subconscious, then yeah, he probably is hiding something. And whenever we read Dr. Jekyll's statement of the case later, whenever Dr. Jekyll reveals his confession of what all he did in the final chapter of this work, you learn that Jekyll did indulge in some unnamed extravagances back in the day. And it's widely speculated among critics what that was. Perhaps he was gay and he was having sex with men all the time, which eventually became something punishable by imprisonment, and a very bad thing happened to Oscar Wilde because of this, ruined his career. Maybe, but if we're looking at Hyde and the things that Hyde wants to do, maybe Jekyll liked to brutalize people. Maybe he was into BDSM. Maybe he was doing all of these things which would have been frowned upon in the society at the time. Maybe he was engaging in underground fights and stuff like that. But whatever it is, he's hiding it. And Stevenson leaves it deliberately vague. That way it can apply to all of the bad things that English people don't want other people to know about. So Utterson wants to help his friend. Page 13 begins to discuss Hyde a little further. So Utterson begins to think about all of the various things that Hyde could be. He begins to imagine what Hyde could be like. And his description of what Hyde might be like to him, or the way he haunts him, is very much reminiscent of this painting here by Henry Fuseli, which is called The Nightmare. We have this little imp on top of this maiden, helpless maiden's body here. And the helpless maiden is shrouded in white, representing innocence here. But we have this evil little imp on top of her. It very much looks kind of like what Hyde would be like. And in the background, we have this evil-looking horse right here that you can barely see. It's a terrible thing. She's having a helpless nightmare. And perhaps Stevenson is saying that, and I know because Stevenson's later essay called A Chapter on Dreams talked about how he began to come up with this idea of Hyde. It has something to do with the terrible things that he would see in his own nightmares and the way in which those nightmares inspired him creatively. We've got this character right here, and it's almost as if Hyde is representation of our nightmares came to life. And this is something that Freud would explore as well, the idea of how the subconscious is a part of us that is expressed through our dreams. When our dreams are less restricted by our modern society, our dreams can go wherever they want to. We don't really have any control over them. And so this work would begin the study of, psychological study of dreams as a valid way to understand why we do the things we do. Back in the day, they thought that, our dreams really aren't part of our conscious life, so they're not an object worthy of scientific study. Okay? But this work is kind of implying that, yeah, probably they are. Because the terrors that we feel in our dreams, if indeed you have a really bad dream, it can haunt you for the rest of the day. It can really affect you. So I've got that page dog-eared, meaning that it's a key page in regards to Hyde's character traits. Another thing is on this page right here, Utterson says if he could but once set eyes upon him, he thought the mystery would lighten and perhaps altogether roll away. So this society, English society, was an age of progress. It's an age that believed that scientific thought, if we can continue with scientific rational inquiry, we can discover everything about everything. We can cure all the things that ill us. We can cure syphilis. Nowadays it would be compared to we can cure AIDS. If we trust in science, science can find all the answers that we have. But Hyde is representative of something that if he continues to study, he hopes he can understand him better, but Hyde continues to defy explanation. And so this is a fear that maybe there are things that even modern science can't explain. Maybe there are ghosts. They might really be out there. Modern science says there are no ghosts, but maybe there really are hauntings and things like that we can't explain. And it's a terrible fear. So with 5 minutes left, I'm going to anticipate a few things that you're going to be reading as you go forward. In particular, some pages that I think are significant are going to be pages 17, toward the end of the Search for Mr. Hyde chapter, And then you're going to begin to take a look at how Jekyll, as he is introduced, begins to change. The beginning of the remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon chapter, I think, is important. That's on page 28. We see a change in Dr. Jekyll. Some people like to write about how Jekyll changes over the course of the narrative. And also on your quiz, if you're looking at him and trying to define him, that'll be a good page to look for. And then going forward toward next time, you're going to have to read about halfway through the novel, the novella. Toward the end of Dr. Lanyon's narrative, on pages 49 and 50, we'll begin to see Hyde finally reveal himself. And then the most important chapters that we're going to be working forward is Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, and you'll be reading that as you go forward toward next week as well. That's usually the people who write essays on this work, the meat of it comes from that chapter right there. Okay, any questions about this work before I start summarizing?